Jesse Cosme, and this is my presentation on the article Workers and Community Relief for a community-based participatory research class. So I'm going to start with background and discussion of community health concerns. So the case takes place in North Carolina, mostly rural areas of North Carolina, in the context of Hurricane Floyd in 1999, where 7,000 homes were destroyed, 17,000 homes were deemed uninhabitable, and more than 47,000 residents were in public shelters. Within that, it's in a broader context of, this hurricane takes place within a broader context of communities that face large amounts of racial discrimination and a lot of racial segregation, poverty, unemployment, and overall inadequate housing pre-existing the hurricane. African American communities being predominantly affected by these discriminatory practices, poverty, unemployment, and inadequate housing. And within that, the long-term recovery efforts carried out by the local, state, and federal governments being inadequate and discriminatory as a result of these pre-existing social, economic, and material conditions, and exacerbated once the hurricane hits. Also, something of note that came out was a lack of political power by a lot of the local African American communities, and a need for mechanisms to broaden their ability to advocate for the needs that they had after the hurricane. So within that, the project, the CBPR project, this article describes, had a couple different goals, the overall goals being around environmental justice, social justice, and racial justice in the context of disaster. And within that, political empowerment, making sure that especially the African American community was able to advocate for themselves based off the lines of environmental justice, social justice, and racial justice. Very much focused on survivors' immediate and urgent recovery needs, such as dealing with health threats and substandard housing. And then there was two specific cases within this context that were highlighted by the article. One of them was called Unearthing State Landfill Data. And this project, the goal was to reveal the land use dangers of a temporary housing site used by African American displaced residents. The city had placed them there, and there was suspicion that this was a former coal ash dumping site, and some environmental hazards and dangers existing because of that. So trying to discern whether or not that was accurate. Then finally, the second one being combining strengths to document discrimination and need. Their shared goals here were to systemically document the survivors' experience of relocation, living conditions, and potential threats to health and loss of community as a result of the flooding, to begin to mobilize the survivors for action, and to give survivors a voice. Description of the community academic partnership. So the community groups were brought together through this coalition called the Workers and Community Relief and Aid Project, used acronym WRAP. Some of the community organizations involved in WRAP were Black Workers for Justice, North Carolina Fair Share, North Carolina Low Income Housing, Concerned Citizens of Trillery, and the North Carolina Student Rural Health Coalition. And then this was working in partnership with a group called SHARE. And SHARE was a pre-existing health CBPR relationship through the University of North Carolina. And so they worked together to create this partnership after Hurricane Floyd. So CBPR approach taken, these projects were follow the fundamental CBR principle that says start where the people are. So SHARE and that pre-existing participatory research agency meeting the people where they're at and understanding what their desires and needs were, and working in conjunction with them to outline the projects and approaches. And for unearthing state and landfill data, this entailed following community direction while using academic research, knowledge, and access to uncover previous land use history. And within the combining strengths to document discrimination and need, it involved capacity building on survey reports, community involvement in survey creation and carry out of surveys, and combining community understanding, vernacular knowledge, and desired outcomes, blended with the ideas of academic rigor and acceptance, which I'll go into more detail as we work through the presentation. So the methods used for unearthing state landfill data, it was review of historic documents and literature. So the university had some of its research students sort through historical documents, file up public information requests, and things of that nature in order to uncover previous land use, to figure out what that land was used for and what could be some of the hazardous chemicals in the area, and what that may mean in terms of health outcomes for the residents that were displaced and placed there. And then within combining strengths to document discrimination and need, there was some participatory observation where the academic partners sat in on community meetings and listened to them express some of their needs, frustrations, experiences of discrimination, and the like. And then within that, from that, building surveys. And within that, the surveys, flood survivors and members of RAP visited temporary housing sites to describe the purpose of the survey, asked survivors for their ideas on questions to include in the survey as well. RAP's university partner formatted the survey according to the general category themes and used the survivors' language with some exceptions. There were times where the academic partners would find the survey questions to be somewhat redundant, or having two questions and speaking with the community to see how they can rework these questions so that they can be more direct, simple, and seek out what it is that they're really trying to uncover. So review of the process. Unearthing state landfill data had a very straightforward process, and I thought that there needed to be a need for better outcomes through the use of the data, which I'll get into a bit more. But it seemed like there wasn't the desired outcomes that came out of it. Combining strengths to document discrimination and need. There was a balance of formality and scientific approaches to communal-centric orientation. So there was some give and take from both sides, from the community of wanting the surveys to be less formal, to be able to be articulated in a more conversational manner, and really meet the needs of what they wanted, while the academic partners wanted to make sure that the surveys were going to be held up to scientific rigor and critique. So trying to toe that line was an important part of the process. Interviewers serving at their own sites. So that was an interesting dynamic, and I thought is relevant to the work that I did, where a lot of the data being accumulated is being done by myself, who is someone who also interacts with that community beyond just my surveying of them or my interviewing of them. So that will sometimes bring out certain elements that they wouldn't share with someone who they don't know, while at the same time it may cause them to hold back certain things because of how close they are to the person. Then attempted versus completed surveys. They seem like the article had discussed some difficulties tracking no responses by the people carrying out the surveys. So that's an element that was a bit of a challenge. And then at the end, the community was a part of validating the survey's results and making sure that they reflected the accuracy of what they were seeing. So regarding results and outcomes, unearthing state and landfill data, it uncovered state records showing that hundreds of African American flood survivors had been relocated without their knowledge on an industrial coal ash landfill. Within that, the North Carolina State Health Department arranged for soil testing and coverage of exposed coal ash with the layer of soil, and the pace of finding alternative housing for site residents was accelerated. Something was that I saw as a failure within that was the North Carolina failed to acknowledge the racist environmental discrimination when it came to the types of people who were placed there, which was predominantly African American community placed on this site without being explicitly told of the history of it, where it was being used as a coal ash site up to just before the hurricane hit. So it wasn't like it was something that they were not aware of. And so they denied this community the ability to consent appropriately to being placed there. And though they claimed that there was no, there wasn't going to be harmful outcomes based off the soil testing that they did, still the simple fact of allowing a community to consent whether or not they're willing to take that risk would have been a more appropriate approach. And then after that, trying to accelerate their placement, sure, is fine. But again, they still had to live there during that time period. So results as outcomes when it comes to the combining strengths to document discrimination and need. The partnership determined that RAP's university partner would analyze the data. Actually, at the time, the person doing the analysis had the time and experience to conduct a quick turnaround and produce a summary report. Included both qualitative and quantitative analysis, as there was a lot of yes/no questions, then structured with a further elaboration, so that they can depict things in a quantitative form and conduct statistical analysis, while at the same time also providing enriched descriptions. And then finally, the survey report and presentation included, various elements of poor conditions and racial discrimination, nuance experienced by survivors, which was very important for them to highlight. Survivors really wanted to make it clear that the experience were nuanced and not get lost within the entirety of the narrative. There also was extensive price gouging by landlords after the hurricane, spiking up rents as housing availability was more and more scarce. There was a health decline for a lot of people as a result, and then destruction of communal spaces that often acted as meeting places for people to get together and exercise their communal and political power. So when it came to dissemination for the Unearthing State Landfill data, the student researchers summarized and published the published information on a health hazards presentation on health hazards present in coal ash, following a presentation of his findings at Camp Depression, which was the camp how the coal ash landfill housing area was called colloquially by the people living there. RAP held a press conference that was covered by local media where they shared these findings and urged the state to do something about it. And as I said before, the state did some testing of the soil and also expedited some of the people moving into different housing. In terms of dissemination for combining strengths to document discrimination and need, there was an agreement from the onset on the content of and intending an audience for a final report that would be released at a flood survivor summit that they were to plan after the survey analysis was completed. RAP partners also spent several meetings discussing how to apply these findings to create broader structural and systemic changes at the local and state levels. And once everything was done, they released a 10-page report, again emphasizing the nuance and difference within the survivors while also pointing out some common threads. The survey results were presented in slides and as well as taking interview excerpts to flood survivors, grassroots organizations, and agency representatives at the Survivor Summit, as previously agreed on. Media coverage of the Survivor Summit through sending out press release and promotion by RAP really pushed public officials to attend and to act on the results. And then there was also rallies and advocacy directly targeting public officials. They met with budget advisory and budget advisory board and policy advisors, mainly on commerce and housing, to discuss their findings and advocate for additional changes. So conclusion, next steps. It seemed like there was a bit of discouraging conclusions, where at the end it talked about it being 8 years since these studies took place. And RAP didn't sustain as an organization, but it was optimistic that some of its members transferred skills to other projects and refined them. And a lot of it came from that community building work done through this. Despite some despite efforts to gain support, there was at least one all-black community that sustained extensive water damage during the flooding and never received any adequate financial assistance. So showing that even though these partnerships are beneficial, there still is a difficult hill to climb oftentimes with the advocacy side of things. Assessment of strengths, I thought that it was really great to see the trust between RAP and SHARE, both RAP being viewed as by the community as an organization, quote, for survivors and of survivors, and also SHARE as an academic institution or organization or academic partner rather, being trusted by the community as well, and having a pre-existing relationship before the hurricane hit. University partners' access and ability to shield survivors from retaliation was important, especially when it came to their access around getting public information. Some people don't know how to gain public information, how to complete a public information request, and are afraid that if they advocate for themselves in these poor conditions and if they get kicked out of any of these camps, they'll have nowhere to go. So the university being able to be the face of that instead of individual survivors. Also, balance with communal, local knowledge of the area, key players, and living conditions. That was very important of seeing the academic partners really embrace that and combine all these elements into direct action. The academic partners also strongly emphasize multiple types of data to accommodate different audiences that have power to change the situation, where what policy advocates or policy writers may want to see is completely different than maybe what you want to share with news and media and things like that, who may want to push a different narrative in order to advocate for that change. And the experience that the survivors had gained by participating in the research helped them better communicate their own concerns and needs and tell the stories of other survivors. So just by experiencing it, they were able to better articulate in a way that can lead to actual change. And so assessment of weaknesses, it seemed like it was very much a mixed victory where there were some positive outcomes out of it, but it left the community feeling a bit unfulfilled. Oddly enough, I met some of these people who worked on these projects in North Carolina when I was doing similar work in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and they also said the same, and also that they were denied that the state denied that any of the issues of environmental racism was involved. The lack of ownership by the state was difficult, and I would say that it would have been helpful to press that more through the advocacy side of things, but I'm not sure how much more that could have been done there. Also, the new site where many residents were offered housing after discovering the ash of the landfill presented other hazards as well. So they were taken out of one bad situation into another. So the outcomes didn't seem to really fulfill to all the work that they put in to prove that there was issues. So again, just speaking to the difficulties of the advocacy side of things. But that's it as it comes to my presentation, and thank you very much.